history lesson. This is about the evaluation of them. So if there are any people who want to run, feel free to run right now. So, anyway, as I said, so this is about the historic railroad evaluation and streamlining project that we have. So speaking today is myself, Britta Anderson. I'm a cultural resource unit with MnDOT.
We can't hear you.
Oh. Okay, I will speak up. I guess I'll just have to yell. Hi, I'm Britta Anderson. I'm a historian with the Cultural Resource Unit at MnDOT, and I'd like to introduce Nicole Foss.
Hello, I'm Nicole Foss. I'm the Environmental Review Transportation Liaison at the State Historic Preservation Office.
And then Andrew Schmidt.
Yes, hi. Andrew Schmidt with Streamline Associates. I'm a consultant with MnDOT.
So basically, just a little bit of information. We also have another partner. Her name is Miranda, and she's with the DNR. However, she's presenting at a different section for this conference, so she's not going to join us, but she is very much involved in this process with us as well. So I just wanted to give her a shout out. So anyway, the presentation that we're looking at is we're going to be looking like an overview of railroads. We're going to be looking at the transportation and the movement between in the 1900s, and then we're going to be looking at understanding railroads as historic properties in terms of what we look at as historic preservationists. And then we're going to discuss the Railroad Multiple Properties Determination Form, which we short to MPDF. So, and then we have the Railroad Organization Review, Solutions and Benefits, and then Case Studies. So if you guys have any questions, we have some time at the end to go over those, but we'll just keep plowing through. So, and I will turn it over to Andrew. Here we go.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, come on. When we think about railroads today, we might think about the freight train rumbling along as we're sitting at the crossing, waiting in our cars. Or we might think about a leisurely trip on the Amtrak. Or maybe the old depot, like the one across the street here, that's now offices. But for people 100 or more years ago, railroads touched on almost all areas of life. They were the only realistic option for long distance travel. They impacted the geography of the state, of cities big and small. They were a major driver of the economy, and they made the connections to the outside world. Before railroads arrived in Minnesota in 1862, before they arrived, travel was much different, much slower. To travel from Chicago to St. Paul would take about 2 weeks by a combination of railroads and riverboats. It was even slower within the state to travel from St. Paul to the Pembina settlement up at the Canadian border, about half the distance to Chicago, also took 2 weeks. Think about the old ox cart trails. After railroads arrived by 1880, those same trips would take less than 2 days. And by the early 20th century, railroads, as I said, were really the only long-distance transportation option. They carried the bulk of the U.S. mail, 77% of all freight, and 98% of the traveling public went by rail at that time. They also impacted the very geography of the state. The locations of cities, when you get out of the major river valleys, like Mississippi, Minnesota, and St. Croix, the location of the cities was because of the railroads. If you ever looked at a map of, you can trace cities along the railroad lines, and they're spread out about 6 miles apart. And that's because the steam locomotives needed a refill of water about every 6 miles. Railroads established a station, towns and cities grew up around them. Also, the way cities were organized were because of the railroads. You had your railroad zone with your grain elevators and stockyards and freight houses. You also had your main street, your main commercial street that was either parallel with or perpendicular to the railroad line. And as I said, railroads, a major driver of the economy. industries were completely dependent on railroads for bringing in the raw materials and hauling out their finished products. Maybe the best known example would be the Minneapolis flour milling district. In the 1860s, Minneapolis had plentiful water power because of St. Anthony Falls, but lacked an adequate supply of wheat to mill into flour. It wasn't until the late 1870s when there were sufficient railroad connections coming from western Minnesota, and especially the Red River Valley, when there was enough wheat, and then also enough connections east for the milled flour. And then by the 1880s, as probably everyone knows, Minneapolis was the leading flour milling center in the country. Couldn't have happened without the railroad connections. And that played out in cities and towns throughout the state. Also, industries provided railroads with the materials, the wood, steel, and coal that they used. They built equipment and machinery for the railroads. And railroad companies themselves were major employers. Nationwide, in 1920, they employed 2 million people. That was about 5% of the US labor force at the time, and actually just under 2% of the total US population. So the old, I've been working on the railroad, that was real back then. And finally, as I said, they provided the connections to the outside world. They carried, as I said, the bulk of the US mail. They brought in traveling shows like theater performances and circuses. They brought in goods beyond the bare necessities. They also provided travel for recreation. Lake Minnetonka developed as an early tourist resort center in the 1870s because the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad had provided a connection in the 1860s. By the early 20th century, people were taking hunting excursions to northern and western Minnesota. They were taking shopping excursions into Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so all those connections were provided by railroads. And so it's important to understand that railroads were important beyond their impacts on each local community, but for those connections that they made, the distances that they traveled. And that significance is best conveyed by the linear nature of the railroads themselves. But that raises some issues for us as historic preservation professionals. How do we inventory and evaluate those linear railroad corridors? And I'll hand it over to Nicole to talk about some of those challenges.
Oh gosh, okay, no problem.
Yeah. All right. I'll try to talk loud enough. I guess raise your hand in the back if you can't hear me. Raise your hand in the back if you can't hear me. All right. So as Andrew mentioned, and I think probably many of you are familiar with a lot of these challenges, there are challenges to railroads because of the resource type that they are. So one of the most apparent is that they are massive in linear scale. They traverse the state and then beyond the state's borders. So you have sometimes a single main line that runs through more than half the state with its various branches and spurs. They're passing through various geographic regions, different types of settlement development, resource extraction. So a single rail line could be significant in various historic contexts and geographic locations. Other than roadways, of course, there's nothing quite like railroads. Thank you. So because of their, I'm sorry, I think I skipped it back there. Yes. So because of their massive linear scale, railroads were often inventoried in segments, and this makes sense just from a practical perspective. When you have a railroad that's in a project area for a compliance project, you're not necessarily going to be able to go out and inventory the entire line. Could be hundreds of miles. So in the State Historic Preservation Office statewide inventory, the vast majority of inventory forms that we have for railroads are railroad segments. And for the most part, reasonable efforts were made to establish start and end points of these railroad segments or termini.
that corresponded to their development history and the companies that built them. But we also have several railroad segments that are somewhat arbitrarily defined depending on which part of the corridor fell within a project area. So that just adds to the complexity of encountering these in the course of research and documentation. And then finally, they have very complex company and construction histories. So by their nature, because they're so long and because they pass through so many different kinds of landscapes, they were constructed in phases. Often different companies built different parts of the rail line, and then they needed to be rebuilt and sometimes realigned through time. So along with the complex nature of railroads comes complexity around their National Register of Historic Places eligibility status. So you can have situations where the main line itself is eligible and certain segments are not, or conversely, maybe the main line is not eligible for listing in the National Register, but individual segments are. They can have their own individual significance, or a segment may be a historic property because it contributes to another listed or eligible district that may not have much to do with railroads at all, but the railroad supports the significance of that district. Another complexity around eligibility is that sometimes at various points, certain lines were recognized to be significant, and then segments fell within project areas, and those segments were determined eligible for listing for the purposes of that project review, but no formal documentation was prepared on the line as a whole that would establish its boundaries or its period of significance or its area of significance. So you can have eligibility come up, something's eligible, but we don't have specific information about when it's eligible to or its areas of significance. That just was never formally documented. All right. And let's see, I think, Britta, do you back a few, or well, actually, I think I just have a couple more. And then we have, for continuing with complex eligibility, sometimes there's cases where segments may overlap or run side by side in the same right-of-way and have different eligibilities. So there's an example of the St. Paul and Pacific branch line between Minneapolis and East St. Cloud. It shares a right-of-way with the Northern Pacific. There are two tracks running side by side, operated by two different companies, each going a different direction. One is eligible and one's not. So when that shows up in your project area, you got a lot going on in a single right-of-way. And then finally, we'll be talking a little bit more about, or I shouldn't say a lot more about this, the 2013 multiple property documentation form that was prepared for railroads. It lays out registration requirements, so there's consistency and comprehensiveness in how we evaluate those. But there's a lot of segments and lines that were evaluated prior to the MPDF, or maybe some that don't utilize those registration requirements. And so when those come up in projects, they need to be reevaluated using the MPDF.
Well, hopefully the microphone helps. You can hear me a little better. Because of some of the challenges in inventorying and evaluating railroads that Nicole discussed, in the mid-2000s, MnDOT sponsored a statewide railroad study and teamed with SHPO and hired a consultant team that I was fortunate enough to be part of. That resulted in a National Register multiple property documentation form for railroads in Minnesota, lovingly known as the Railroads MPDF. Prior to that time, back in the 1980s, railroads were understood as critical to the state's development, but historical surveys often focused on individual structures like depots and bridges. By the 1990s and early 2000s, we began looking beyond the depots and bridges to the railroad corridors themselves as historic properties. But we still lacked an understanding of the full railroad network of the state, and there were no railroad-specific historic contexts, and they were typically inventoried as segments, or just portions that happen to be within your survey area. So in 2006 and 7, I was part of the team that prepared the railroad's MPDF. That the idea was to develop a framework for how do we go about evaluating railroads in Minnesota. The first thing was developing railroad historic contexts. The first context was sort of an overview of railroad development and the railroad network in Minnesota and how it evolved over time. Then we developed company histories for the various railroad companies that built in Minnesota. Histories of the companies, but also the construction episodes of the railroads that they built. And then also thematic contexts. And those contexts derived largely from the existing statewide context that SHPO staff had developed, but we further fleshed out those contexts and made them specific to railroads and the roles that they played within those historic contexts. So we took like northern Minnesota logging or iron ore mining and focused on the role of the railroads for transporting those raw materials, for example. Once we had the historic contexts, we developed the property types that are associated with railroads and that would be likely to meet National Register criteria. There could have been dozens of property type if we identified each individual structure. We kept it fairly limited. As you can see, 3 types of historic districts: railroad corridors, which is what you think of the railroad line, it's the railroad corridor. Railroad station historic districts, which is sort of the depot and the station area around it, and then railroad yards. Both of those could be part of a larger railroad corridor. And then also individual buildings and structures that may meet National Register criteria individually, which would be the depots, crossing structures like bridges or trestles, engine houses, and also section houses. For the rest of this session, though, we will focus on the Railroad Corridor Historic District as being the linear property and the most challenging for the inventory and evaluation. And so what is a railroad corridor? It's not just any portion of the railroad. It's not that portion that's just within your APE. And for National Register purposes, the MPDF defines them as extending from major resource procurement areas or commercial or industrial nodes or important transfer points to major processing centers or terminal transfer points. Essentially, what are the important points or areas that the railroads were connecting? And the railroad corridor consists of the railroad right-of-way, and that can be broken down to the track structure, which consists of rails, ties, and ballast, the railroad roadbed, which is the prepared surface that the track structure rests upon, the railroad roadway, which is the roadbed plus any additional earthworks like cuts or raised grades or ditches. And a railroad corridor can also include individual structures, so your depots and bridges and so forth within a railroad corridor. Once we had that property type established, we needed to identify registration requirements or eligibility thresholds for a railroad corridor, which, by the way, a railroad corridor is the railroad line. An eligible railroad corridor is a railroad corridor historic district. So what would make it an eligible historic district? First, in thinking about the National Register criteria, we felt criterion A would be the only one that a railroad corridor would likely to be eligible under. For criterion B, significant persons, the railroad line itself is not likely to be the best representation of a person's life. Even someone like James J. Hill, there's the Hill House, there's the Great Northern Headquarters Building, both in St. Paul. Those would better illustrate, his life and work. Criterion C, by the time railroads came to Minnesota, and especially by the time the majority were being built in the 1880s and later, railroad companies had pretty much figured out the engineering of how you go about building a railroad. And so it was unlikely that a railroad corridor would be a significant example of design or engineering under criterion C. Individual building or structure like a depot or bridge certainly could be. And under criterion D, railroads were so well documented that we felt railroad corridors were unlikely to provide significant new information. Now I should note that archaeological sites associated with railroads are not covered by the railroad's MPDF. And so under criterion A, we also determined that the area of transportation would be the area that railroad corridors are eligible under. Because at the end of the day, what did railroads do? They hauled goods and people from one point to another. They provided transportation. Other properties could better illustrate industry or commerce or recreation, but for the railroad corridor itself, it's transportation. So under National Register, criterion A in the area of transportation, a railroad corridor could be eligible if it met one of 4 registration requirements that we established as part of the MPDF. The first one being the railroad corridor opened up a region of the state that lacked other transportation options. So for example, the St. Paul and Sioux City built out of the Mankato area southwest into Iowa between 1868 and 1872. In that corner of the state, there were no other railroads, no navigable rivers to speak of. They just didn't have. And following the construction of that railroad, there was rapid settlement of the area. So that railroad would meet registration requirement 1. 2, a railroad corridor connected important resource procurement area or a commercial node with an important terminal or transfer point. And that connection, and it was either the first or a dominant railroad making that connection, and it led to a significant expansion. An example there, the Brainerd and Northern Minnesota Railroad, which built between Brainerd through Walker up to Bemidji between 1894 and 1898. And at that time, it was the first railroad into that portion of the North Woods. And so it connected the northern pine forests with an important transfer point, which was Brainerd, because from there it could connect to either dumping the logs into the Mississippi River to float downstream, or with the St. Paul and Northern Pacific. And so that railroad meets registration requirement 2. Requirement 3, a railroad corridor was an influential component of the state's transportation network. Another example, again, the Brainerd and Northern Minnesota. When it built, as I said, it was the first railroad line into that area. It also, in the connection that it made at Brainerd, prior to that time, most of the cut logs would be floated downstream by rivers or streams. Following the construction of that railroad, they began to be hauled entirely by rail. And so it brought about a shift in transportation patterns. So it meets registration requirement 3. Requirement 4 is that a railroad corridor connected one or more significant railroad corridors. An example there would be Minnesota Transfer in the Midway area of St. Paul, and between downtown St. Paul and Minneapolis. And that was established in 1884 and constructed multiple connecting lines, which allowed for, at the time, railroad traffic was getting very congested. And so that allowed for switching operations and connecting between different railroads. And then allowed for an expansion because of the efficiency that it brought about. So that one would be registration requirement 4. Then if you have a significant railroad corridor, much like any other historic property, it needs to retain historic integrity. And because of the linear nature of the railroad, and because that linear quality is so important to a railroad, we felt it needs to maintain at least some visual expression of the railroad roadway for the entire length of the railroad corridor. So if there's a portion of the roadway that's been abandoned, has been redeveloped, is not extant, Railroad Corridor Historic District could not exist. Unless if you identified a smaller portion that has significance separate from the larger railroad corridor. And I'll give an example of that when we get to the case studies. And so the railroad's MPDF, it was completed in 2007 and entered into the National Register in 2013. And since that time, we've been using it to evaluate railroad corridors, but there still have been challenges along the way. And so once again, Nicole will talk about some of those challenges and limitations.
All right, thanks, Andrew. So one of the challenges, and this is going to focus, I talked about the challenges of railroads in general, sort of inherent built into the resource type, and now I'm going to focus on some inventory challenges, and this pertains to both the SHPO that's tasked with maintaining the statewide inventory, and then everybody who needs to research, document, and evaluate railroads. So one of the challenges that comes up with this is that, as I mentioned, the majority of railroads that have been inventoried in segments, and when those segments were inventoried, a lot of times it was under the company name that came up during research, and over time there may have been various companies that owned that railroad. So it's usually often inventoried like under a single company name or one or two company names. Or it may be inventoried under the nickname for the line. And the challenge with that is then linking it back to the parent company. So when this comes up in research, what was the parent company for that railroad segment? And when we use the term parent companies in this context with the railroad inventory, what it refers to is one of 15 companies that was operating in Minnesota in the early 1960s. Sorry guys, I can continue, you'll hear me and maybe not get the visual technology, you know how it is. But these 15 companies that were operating in Minnesota in the 1960s were documented in a seminal work on railroads in Minnesota, Rails to the North Star by Richard Prosser. And this was used to establish a data organization project that I'm going to talk about a little more later, but I just want you to know when I say parent company, it sounds like the original company. It's actually a company that by the 1960s had basically merged with or acquired all these other companies that popped up through time since 1862 when railroads first entered Minnesota. And so trying to match up these local segments with parent companies is a challenge. There were no statewide visual aids where you could, for example, walk up to a map and see what segments and lines have been inventoried already. And this was actually partly tricky because of the inventory number system that's been used historically for railroad segments in Minnesota. Oh, sorry, it's not cooperating. I'll have a graphic to illustrate this better, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with the way that we use the county code and then the municipality code for inventorying resources. And this was used for railroad lines and segments as well. So there's some examples here, but in this case, you'll see there's a continuous track, one line, contiguous segments. And these segments were all inventoried separately, but the line is passing through the city of St. Paul, the city of West St. Paul, actually, which is in Dakota County. I made up these codes, so forgive me, but and then into MnDOT Heights. And so the point here with the graphic is just to show you that these all have different county, city codes as part of the number prefix. And so this is how the hard copy inventory forms were filed, meaning you couldn't just go to the drawer and pull out these three segments that's part of a contiguous line. You'd have to go to different county drawers and then within those go to different municipality sections. And there was no cross-referencing among forms, particularly if these were all inventoried at different times. So it was really hard to actually just get the scope of documentation on a single line. So then the evolution started out with the city municipality code and then added, or actually I should say switched out, instead of using a municipality code for the second part of that number, SHPO began using the code RRD to signify a railroad. The county code was maintained. You'll see XX if the railroad travels through multiple counties. But at least this way, when you went to the drawer, all the railroad segments or lines that were inventoried under the new numbering system would be grouped together under RRD within the county file. So we're moving in the right direction, but that led us to, and I say us, the State Historic Preservation Office and MnDOT Cultural Resources Unit partnered for the Railroad Data Reorganization Project, because it was just becoming really apparent as more and more lines and segments were being inventoried that it was really hard to link these up and to connect them back to their parent companies where a significance would be established. And so in 2017, this partnership, along with Andrew, who we're very fortunate to be presenting on this about, undertook this massive reorganization of the hard copy inventory system on railroads. And the goals of this project were to institute a new inventory numbering system that would be specific to railroads to help make this, when you're working with the hard copy files, so that you could go and find these all in one place if it's part of a continuous line or part of the same company that built them, and establish finding aids and research aids to help you conduct research on railroads and their history and what's been inventoried and evaluated, and then finally provide consistent guidance on how to research, inventory, and evaluate railroads. And so out of this, it was very successful. There was a large-scale reorganization of the hard copy inventory files, and they were grouped by those 15 parent companies that I mentioned, and then within the parent companies, they're divided up by the railroad company that built the line. And actually, you can go to the State Historic Preservation Office, go to the railroad files, and you will find this exact system. It is still in place with our hard files. And also, a new inventory number system was set up. So this used the XX RRD, which you saw in a previous slide, but now there's a parent company code. So for example, GNR is the Great Northern Railroad. So anything that eventually became part of that parent company is going to be inventoried with this inventory number prefix. And then finally, Andrew, CRU, and SHPO developed guidelines for inventorying and evaluating railroads, and you can find these online. They were published in 2019, and they're still very useful, and most of what's covered in this presentation is going to be covered in these guidelines as well. So now, more exciting stuff. Building on this wonderful work, came technology changes which are going to make this information even more accessible. So beginning in 2019, SHPO and MnDOT CRU partnered again to start developing an online statewide inventory application, which is going to be called MnShip, and it launches later this year. And this is going to bring the whole statewide inventory, at least with above ground resources, online and accessible for research, and you'll be able to create and update inventory forms in this application. And I'm just, over the next few slides, going to take you through a couple of different tools that are going to be available in MnShip, which particularly pertain to researching and documenting railroads. So first of all, you'll see this map in MnShip. It's a layer that you can turn on and off, but it shows all the parent company lines color-coded, and it's the peak track mileage year, which was 1930. So the companies are over there on the right. You can scroll through. You can turn on and off certain ones. So if you only want to see Chicago and Northwestern, you can turn off the other colors. But this will be a wonderful tool when a railroad comes up in your project area. You can tie it back to the parent company this way. And then we're really excited because we're going to have an interactive map of all of the inventoried properties in the statewide inventory. So in this case, I'm showing linear properties. There's also polygons for districts and points for things like individual buildings, but linear is obviously perfect for railroads. This is color-coded, so the blue means I selected this specific line because I wanted to see which one it was. But red is resources that have not been evaluated or were found not eligible. Green is eligible or listed. So when you select a resource in here, you can see it pops up with the historic inventory number and the property name and some additional information. And then there's a little view form in the corner of the box, and it will take you right to the inventory form and all the previous documentation, but that's been scanned on this resource. So we're really excited about this interactive map. And then there's going to be various ways that you can research railroads using MnShip. So you can search by, if you know the specific inventory number or name under which it was inventoried, then you can search that way. You can also just put in the beginning of the inventory number. So I just went up to GNR over there in the upper right. And then that's going to bring up a list of all of the properties that have been inventoried under that number. And you'll be able to click and go to each form. And then finally, you can search by historic function and use. So if you put in transportation and rail related, you're going to get a lot of stuff that was all inventoried under that historic function. There's going to be historic aerials in MnShip. So in this example, I have on the layer with the parent companies from 1930. And I'm in Dakota County here. So keeping in mind that this is, the peak track mileage in 1930, I'm looking at the 1937 aerial. And this is a wonderful way you can actually toggle between the different historic aerials and present day aerials. And it's a really good way to check if your rail corridor still has that visual continuity from a present day aerial compared to its original alignment. So I think this will be really helpful. And then when you create a new inventory form, you'll be able to choose the background map on which you draw the railroad geometry, so that'll help, depending on what's going to be the most useful there. And you'll choose the railroad parent company of your line to generate the inventory number. So you can see that we're continuing this inventory numbering system that was established with the Railroad Data Organization project. And if you have any questions, of course, we're happy to help you figure out the railroad parent company to generate your number. But you can always go back to that 1930s layer, which is right here in MnShip, or check out the online 2019 guidelines. And then finally, MnShip is going to have a cognitive search capability, so you can put in a search term, word, or phrase. In this case, I typed in Northwestern Railroad. It's going to search all the PDFs that are in the application, and we have 105,000 inventory properties, so it's a lot. But you can pull up the different documents that brought this, came up with the search term, and then it will highlight the search term in the document. So hopefully this will make railroads even more fun and easy to inventory and research. All right, I'll turn it back over to Andrew.
As part of that 2018-2019 project to organize the railroad data, we also developed guidelines for how you go about inventorying and evaluating railroad corridors, because they're unlike other properties because of that linear nature that we've talked about. So as Nicole touched on, when you do your literature search, normally for your survey area, you provide the location, the sections and the township and range to SHPO staff. They run a database query and provide you a list of all the properties that have been previously inventoried within that area. For railroads, unless the railroad that's in your survey area just happened to have been previously inventoried, that portion, you're not going to know about it if it's the next county over or even the next town over. And so when you are doing a literature search for railroad corridor, you first need to establish which of the 15 railroad parent companies it's associated with. So let's say, for example, you're doing a survey north of Two Harbors, up there in Lake County, and you consult the Master Railroads map, and you can see, okay, my railroad was associated with the Duluth-Mesabian Iron Range, or DM&IR. Once you know that, you can go to the individual company maps, and because oftentimes, as Nicole mentioned, the railroads were built by different companies that later merged, and in this case, the case of the DM&IR, there was both the Duluth and Iron Range and the Duluth-Mesabian Northern that in 1930 merged to form the DM&IR. So in our example, up there north of Two Harbors, you would see that it was in fact the Duluth and Iron Range that built the railroad. So then you can go to, prior to the launching of MnShip, you'd go to the SHPO files, the file group for DM&IR, pull the folder for the Duluth and Iron Range, and it would have all the previous portions of that railroad that had been inventoried, if any had been previously inventoried. And then from there, you can follow more of a typical literature search. You would review the previous inventory forms and survey reports, if any. Consult the railroad's MPDF for your company history and construction episodes. Also, of course, consult published histories, published railroad histories or county histories, and so forth. Then once you've completed that literature search, you identify the railroad corridor that your portion of the railroad is associated with. And if you recall, the railroad corridor connects important endpoints. So in this case, it would be connecting the Mesabi Iron Range with the ports at Two Harbors and Duluth. So your railroad corridor could extend from Virginia all the way to Duluth. And then you would evaluate that railroad corridor, if it hasn't been previously, you would evaluate it as a whole. Now you don't need to go through and inventory everything within that entire corridor, but you do need to understand if that railroad corridor as a whole meets National Register criteria. And then you can identify a segment within that railroad corridor for your field survey. And a segment in the user's guide is identified as a length of railroad corridor between two reasonable endpoints, which could be from a historic station to station or within an area of an identifiable construction episode. So again, in this example, you would identify a segment as between these historic stations or rail stops, and then you conduct your field survey within that area. And then you would follow sort of a standard field survey with your photographs and field notes documenting the conditions of the property. And then also prepare your inventory forms using the new railroad inventory numbers. After completing the user's guide, it's been very helpful, but we also realized there are still some challenges. And that led us to a series of streamlining studies, and Britta will talk about that.
This is my first mic experience, so you'll have to forgive me if I say anything too loud.
Anyway, so they've done awesome work, but we have all this information, but what does it make sense? How does it work on terms of like MnDOT and compliance? Because even though we have all these great forms, there's no good way to address it, or like if you're looking at a project and someone tells you, oh, I got something in Duluth. Oh no, like Duluth, the mecca of railroads. So anyway, so why streamlining? So this is just to illustrate all the different parent companies from the 1930s. This is not even an accurate number of the actual railroad lines and corridors that have been evaluated. So this is just to show, like, these are the still active railroad lines. These aren't even the ones that are historic, that are just lying about everywhere. So the solution to railroad evaluations, it all came down to efficiency. So in 2020, MnDOT and the DNR partnered to review all the railroad companies in the state because, as you know, a lot of trails go on railroad beds because they're not active or they're just
in an area that would benefit from it. So what MnDOT did is they hired Andrew, again, to come about and start evaluating these in a systematic parent company order. So this is just a Great Northern Railway map of all the different corridors within the Great Northern Railroad. So you can see how this can get really sticky. And if I will be honest with you, when I first started, when someone would say BNSF, yeah, I'd be like, what? Like, what is that? So then you have to go back through and you have to find that, oh, by the way, it's the Wilmer-Sioux Falls Railway Corridor. That's the one that's in your project area. Without these maps, I'd be like, I don't know. So anyway, so the methods of the corridors is that it's a collaborative effort. MnDOT and DNR find out which company we want to do. We're starting with the largest and we're kind of working our way down as we go. So we would work together, the three of us, usually Miranda, Andrew, and I, kind of go through a railroad company and kind of, he does all the work, let's face it, I just review it. But I appreciate his work nonetheless. And then the lucky thing is that then we get to shove all this information back to Nicole to then review and evaluate, because the SHPO is the keeper of this information. We're just the producers of this great system. So far, as of since 2020, we've evaluated 3 major companies, and this year we're starting the Chicago and Northwestern. So it's been very helpful because I've only been with MnDOT a year, and I've already appreciated how useful it is to have these evaluations of the entire corridors, because I had one project, and then not too long after that I had another project that went through, and it was the same railroad. So having to redo the work over and over is now being eliminated by these streamlining efforts. So what's next? So that's the question. We have several other companies that we need to do, and then what do we do after we've evaluated all of them? Because per compliance, we have to re-review properties that are eligible and not eligible every 10 years. So we need to start kind of looking like, are we set with these evaluations? Do we need to go back and look at them again if they're eligible and not eligible? So it's just, there's some things that we have to figure out. But anyway, the benefits of the railroad studies are that obviously it's a streamline effort for future reviews. So we don't have to keep coming back and doing new inventory forms, as opposed to before, when if your project area just happened, it would just be that segment, but the whole railroad would not be inventoried. That's now gone. We have a better understanding of significant railroads corridors throughout communities. As we know, railroads follow, we think that they follow cities, but it's a lot of times the cities follow the railroads. So knowing which cities, we're like, oh, Marshall, Minnesota. Oh, there's a railroad. So and then you can look at the geographic setup of the city and know, oh, the railroad does follow the main line or the main road. And so you know that it's all likelihood, which it is, Marshall was built as a railroad town. So you can just see that throughout the area, throughout the state. And also what is going to be really, really interesting and really helpful is going to be NIGHTSHIP, which will be mapping. You can look at a city, you can see if there's railroad there. It's just going to be really nice. We also have individual maps that are being created as part of these inventory forms, which again help when you're looking at these from the compliance side. And then also, obviously it's a benefit to all state agencies who deal with historic railroads and the properties. So for the SHPO, it's research and compliance. There, people can go and look and discuss different railroads if they have a question. It's also from a compliance side, so they know what we're working with when we send a project in. We're like, hey, we got this railroad. For MnDOT, it's compliance. It makes our lives easier. Any of my coworkers will email me and be like, hey, I got this railroad. What do you got? And then I go through and I'm like, sometimes the railroads that have not been evaluated under the streamlining, I have to do a lot of background research of trying to figure out which line,
what inventory forms have been done. It's like starting from scratch versus one like Great Northern. It's already been done. I'm like, yes, there, done, check. So it makes my life a lot easier. It's also beneficial to the DNR because they use these railroads or they're putting trails on these railroads lines. It makes our lives a lot easier. So this is the list of remaining parent companies. Now granted, it looks like a lot. And I was assured by Andrew that some of these are small, like individual little railroads that he's going to file into a massive study. But just to know, it is a time consuming, and we're looking probably at least another 4 to 5 years of doing these streamlining projects. So don't fear, it's coming. But if you have questions about Minnesota Transfer Railway, I'll have to get back to you in a few minutes on that one. So, and now Andrew and I are going to kind of go through a case study of looking at different railroads. So this is case study one, and I'll switch back to Andrew. He's got a lot more experience.
Okay, our first case study was actually the first of the streamlining studies, was the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, also known as the Milwaukee Road. One of the railroad corridors we evaluated was the short line, which ran between Minneapolis and St. Paul. It was built in 1880, as I mentioned, by the Milwaukee Road. And at first it seemed like probably not a significant railroad corridor. It was a short, just a 9-mile railroad, connector railroad. And the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad had been providing a similar connection since 1862, almost 20 years prior. And in fact, this one had been previously evaluated as not eligible. But in the course of that streamlining study, we looked at all of the Milwaukee Road rail lines, and we saw that the short line it connected two important railroad corridors. One being the Benton cutoff of the Hastings and Dakota division of the Milwaukee Road, which brought in wheat from western Minnesota and South Dakota into Minneapolis. And then the short line connected, after the wheat was milled into flour, connected the flour to St. Paul and the Milwaukee Roads River Division, which ran along the Mississippi River, crossed into Wisconsin, Outlaw Crescent, and east to Chicago. And that hauled out all the flour, the milled flour, or not all of it, a lot of it. And so this railroad line, in fact, met the registration requirement for connecting two significant railroad corridors. And in addition, the Milwaukee Road was, you could probably call it the dominant railroad in Minneapolis in the 1880s. It brought in the second most amount of freight of any railroad, short only of the second only to the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, later Great Northern. And it hauled out far and away the largest amount of freight. And so we felt that this railroad does meet National Register criteria, and it's still an active railroad, and so it retains its historic integrity. The second case study was the Great Northern St. Vincent Main Line. And this one shows how railroad corridors can be very complex, and that integrity matters for the eligibility. This railroad corridor extended 380 miles from Minneapolis through St. Cloud, northwest through Fergus Falls, north through Crookston, and up to the Canadian border and into Canada. It was built in stages between 1863 and 1879. And in the process, once completed, it connected the Red River Valley and the wheat that was being grown on the Bonanza farms up there, again with the Minneapolis Milling District. And it also made other important early connections along the way. So this one seems like a no-brainer. This has got to be eligible, right? Well, not so fast. As it turns out, about 62 miles of the railroad roadway in the Red River Valley is not extant. And so the railroad corridor as a whole could not be an eligible railroad corridor historic district. Because as I said, there needs to be at least some visual expression for the entire length of the railroad corridor. However, there was a portion of the railroad corridor that was a separate railroad corridor of its own, and that was the original St. Paul and Pacific branch line, which ran from Minneapolis up to East St. Cloud. That railroad line was built between 1863 and 1867, and it provided, we felt it was an influential component of the state's railroad network. It provided early connections within the network and also early population centers of Minneapolis, Anoka, and St. Cloud. And that railroad also retains its historic integrity. And so that railroad corridor is an eligible historic district, but the much larger railroad corridor is not. And so what we're discovering is sometimes significant railroad corridors are not eligible, and sometimes those that seem like they're not significant are in fact eligible. And with that, do you want to?
So, do we have questions? Anyone have questions? Luke, sure.
So, that's me. Did you inventory all the railroads or just the significant ones?
All, the streamlining is doing all of the lines within the corridor, yes.
I'm looking at one in Cook County that's an old lumbering one. I only know about it because the lake that we fish in all the time has a trestle running through it.
Well, this is something I did not know until doing this presentation or recently, is that there are logging and mining railroads that are not being included in this. Just to let everyone know, they're only for commuter and freight. But if you send it to me, I can take a look at it for you.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to help you.
Fine.
Yeah.
I was sort of curious what the long-range goals with the inventory of the historic railroads are. I think you kind of alluded to this previously. Is the idea, does the railroad need to be preserved as a working railroad, or is it enough to preserve it as just the right-of-way, as a discrete right-of-way? And that does that kind of connect with the rails to trails process, that if something is preserved as a trail, that sort of counts as preserving the right-of-way, even if it's not a working railroad anymore?
I think it depends. So for us, for MnDOT, it is just evaluating for when these railroads would come into our project areas. And so we wanted to have detailed information. The benefit is that it is evaluating them and SHPO's salary, keeping them in their repository. But I mean, in terms of we don't own those corridors. Sometimes they've been the railroad could still own them. A city or a county could own them. So in terms of preservation, we can't do anything to them. I do. This is a personal thing, but I do think that the DNR is helpful in maintaining those by doing the rails to trails because they are keeping alignments. However, sometimes those trails won't go for 380 miles. It's segments of it. So, I mean, it just depends. So, I don't think I answered your question fully, but in terms of preservation, that's beyond our control. So.
I'll just add too quickly that a railroad corridor could still retain its integrity if it's been abandoned, but the railroad roadway is intact. So like one of the DNR trails, they might have made some changes, maybe even paved on top of the roadbed, but the earthwork is still intact. So it could still be an eligible railroad corridor because it retains enough of that linear quality. So I don't know if that was maybe what you were getting at with your question also, but I just wanted to point that out.
Next, any other questions?
In a sort of programmatic sense of the streamlining program, that is a bigger question that we'll tackle.
Yes.
Hi. So following back to the previous question, I'm just wondering, Nicole, if you can comment on that, or if you have any coworkers in here, but just kind of the overall, what's the purpose, right? Are we trying to preserve a certain amount, a certain number of these, or do we just want to have the information in case we do? Just kind of curious if you can comment on that.
Great question. I like kind of the questions that are playing off each other with this. So, as Britta mentioned, like the overall goal of this, like why, thank you.
You know, why it's called like a streamlining project is we do want to look at these main lines in their entirety because we want to establish like baseline eligibility for these lines when they come up in projects. And as many of you know, there's state and federal laws that come into play when something is both historically significant and it has integrity to convey that significance. So under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, now it's a historic property. And so, you know, there's laws that come into play depending on, you know, when a project is getting into a historic property railroad corridor. We need to treat it a certain way under compliance reviews. And so I think, you know, this comes in because we're streamlining, we're finding out the eligibility statuses of these lines before they come up in projects. So when they come up in a project, now we know, you know, is this a historic property, and then therefore, you know, is it state and or federal laws that are bearing on how the project is carried out. If the railroad needs, if it's going to be adversely affected and it's going to lose some of its integrity and therefore not be able to convey its historic significance, then we're mitigating that adverse effect on the property. And so hopefully, Marnie, this is a long way of saying, you know, for compliance purposes, it's extremely useful to know this at the outset.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Perhaps Nicole knows what I'm going to ask.
Okay.
Are you going to do archaeology at some point? Are you going to add archaeology in?
That I don't know. I'll have to check with my supervisors. Who? Yes.
Do you utilize LiDAR at all?
Yes.
Yes, we do. So there is statewide data available for LiDAR. So on the railroad maps, what we do is we sort of geo-correct I should back up. The original, when we produced the railroad maps, they were based on a 1930 railroad commissioner's map of all the railroads in the state. And then what we've been doing in the course of the streamlining studies is geo-correcting those using LiDAR data to make sure that the lines on the maps actually do line up with the railroads themselves. So yes, great question.
Lucy, I don't want to leave you in the lurch. I don't know the answer either. You know, if CRU will tackle that in a future stage. But I think it's a really good question because there has been work on developing guidance for railroads as archaeological properties. That's not finalized, and I'm not sure of the current state of that, but I think it's just a good reminder. You know, we are talking about these as sort of above ground resources in the realm of architectural history, but as Andrew mentioned, you know, there are archaeological sites, there are archaeological expressions of railroads and associated with railroads, so it's just a good reminder to keep that in mind as part of any project that's going to have ground disturbance.
So we are at time, but I have our names up here. If you have questions for us, feel free to reach out to us, and I'm happy to share any information that you guys need about railroads in the future. So thank you very much.